Okay, we are ready, Mjriam.
Hello.
Yes, Mjriam, we are ready.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hello. Hi, everyone. My name is Mjriam Samra. I'm sorry for sorry. Sorry if the picture is not clear. I'm having connection problems, so I had to leave the house to make sure to be able to be with you today. It's actually my great honor to have the opportunity to participate in this event, to moderate such a timely and important event on anti-Palestinian racism, and to be together with these very important speakers in an event organized by Law for Palestine in partnership with ARDD, which is Arab Renaissance for Democracy and Development. I am actually a senior officer, a senior research officer at ARDD in Jordan, in Amman. And yes, and it is my pleasure to actually start this this discussion on anti-Palestinian racism. I'll just say a few words in Arabic for our Arabic participant, and then I will switch back to English, which is the language of today's event. So بس بدي احكي لكم، انا اول شيء اسفه اذا لغتي مش كثير قويه بالعربي، بس بدي احكي لكم انه الايفنت النقاش راح يكون بالعربي بالانجليزي، اسفه، بس في مترجم هون بالزوم. اذا تشوفوا في ايكون جلوبال ايكون تحت بالشاشه، و يعني في مترجم في الترجم بالعربي، وكمان يعني الاسبوع اللي جاي راح يكون جاهزه الريكوردينج للنقاش كله مع الترجم. Okay, so having said that, and you know that there is Arabic translation available for those of you who want to follow in Arabic here in on Zoom. We can finally start address the main issue that we want to discuss here together. But before doing that, I really want to thank our speakers, and I really want to thank Jurists for Palestine for joining this event, Law for Palestine and ARDD for actually organizing this event. Then we are here to discuss today about anti-Palestinian racism. Why? Because this is becoming one of the most compelling, one of the most important issues for those who want to address the question of Palestine, especially in Western countries. It's becoming harder, you know, every day harder to talk about Palestine without facing this kind of discrimination or marginalization. We will see that the issue of how Palestinian activism and Palestinian discourse is approached and is approached, particularly in Western country, has been very, has been worsening in the past years, and Palestinians and all those advocating for Palestinians' rights have been accused of, either anti-Semitism or, terrorist connection. And so on. So the idea today, and we will see, our speaker are going to discuss in depth, what this has meant for Palestinians and for those who are advocating for Palestine in their work, in their attempt to advocate for Palestinians' rights. So, the idea today is to discuss about the possible strategies to combat anti-Palestinian racism, what can be done by the international legal community, by human rights lawyers, experts, NGOs to face, the discrimination, the racism that Palestinians are facing today. We need to understand what are the reasons, what are the motives and the incentives of anti-Palestinian racism, and who is facing it, and how this is being implemented, who are the main actors, who are the main instigators behind anti-Palestinian racism. This is all, these are all, points that are going to be addressed by our speakers. I would like, therefore, to give the floor to our first speaker, which is Dania Majid. Dania, thank you so much for being with us. It's really an honor to having you here. Dania is the co-founder and president of the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. She's also the co-founder and artistic director of the Toronto Palestine Film Festival. Dania sits on the steering committee for the Hearing Palestine program at the University of Toronto. In addition to being a long-time advocate for the Palestinian and Arab community, Dania is also a human rights lawyer and housing advocate with a legal aid clinic in Ontario. Thank you, Dania, for joining us. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak on anti-Palestinian racism today and to speak on our recent report on the subject. I will be kicking off today's webinar by taking you through the description that the Arab Canadian lawyers came up with and the journey that got us here through our report. First, I want to acknowledge that the manifestations that we highlight in the report tend to weigh more towards the experiences of Palestinians and the diaspora, which cannot compare to the experiences of racism faced by those in Palestine, such as this morning's raids on the offices of Palestinian human rights defenders, which is an example of anti-Palestinian racism in its most extreme form. Before we get into the description of anti-Palestinian racism found in the report, I wanted to take you through, provide an overview of how it came about. And ACLA's work on the issue came out of our advocacy work on, arising from the hiring scandal at the University of Toronto Faculty of Law, where, if you're not familiar with that scandal, it's where a sitting judge who is a donor to the university interfered in the hiring of Dr. Azarova on behalf of a pro-Israeli lobby group he used to work for because they disagreed with her scholarship on Palestine and Israel. And because we did not want the Palestine piece to be erased from the scandal, the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association described this scandal as anti-Palestinian racism in our advocacy work. However, when we started preparing our submissions to the investigation, we quickly found out there were very few references to anti-Palestinian racism, and there was very few articles or resources that detailed or provided detailed analysis on the term. So we were kind of forced to quickly provide or create, a term that we at that time called a definition, so we could use it in our submission to provide an analysis of the scandal from an anti-Palestinian racism lens. However, after we, made the submissions, we decided not to make our submission public because we did not want to unilaterally impose a definition of APR, anti-Palestinian racism, on the community, and we weren't even sure if one was wanted. So what we did instead was we took the paragraph that we drafted and we embarked on a year-long consultation process, which included meetings and questionnaires. And the questionnaire and our meetings, was shared with academics, lawyers, and activists in Canada, the US, Europe, and Palestine, so we could get their feedback on such a term and, our draft term, I'm very happy we did do that because we got a lot of exceptional feedback. And instead of just putting out the paragraph as we initially thought we were going to do, that feedback became a peer-reviewed report that now can be used as a resource for all our communities across the globe. So I'm going to, this is the description we actually ended up coming with after we got the feedback. And the description says, what is anti-Palestinian racism? Anti-Palestinian racism is a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases, stereotypes, defames, or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. Anti-Palestinian racism takes various forms, including denying the Nakba and justifying violence against Palestinians, failing to acknowledge Palestinians as an indigenous people with a collective identity, belonging, and rights in relation to occupied and historic Palestine, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians, excluding or pressuring others to exclude Palestinian perspectives, Palestinians and their allies, defaming Palestinians and their allies with slander such as being inherently anti-Semitic, a terrorist threat or sympathizer, or opposed to democratic values. So the report itself provides a commentary of each of these elements, which also addresses the feedback we heard. I will now outline a few of these key points that came out of the consultations that are addressed in this description. I should also note that the report itself was written quite broadly so that it could be useful for those outside of Canada. So this is why we consulted internationally, and this is why we included examples from the US and Europe in addition to Canada. So we decided to use the term anti-Palestinian racism versus the other terms that have been circulating for several reasons. First, one of the main principles of the Palestinian movement is a commitment to fight all forms of racism. Second, the oppression of Palestinians is one of settler colonialism and manifests itself in the crimes of apartheid, which are both racist systems that privileges one group over another. The attacks on Palestinians and our allies is used to uphold these racist systems. It isn't necessarily or exclusively about the hatred of the individual, but more about targeting those who dare to speak up for Palestinians and against these systems. And importantly, there's also much work, learning, and solidarity happening with our allies resisting anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, as well as other forms of discrimination. And we need to be working together to fight racism in its broader sense. So next, I wanted to also touch upon why we decided to call this a description of anti-Palestinian racism framework and not a definition. And this came out of the feedback we received from the consultations. And in considering the feedback we got, it really appeared that a definition was going to be perceived as something that was rigid and final. And we really were conscious about not wanting to exclude anyone's experiences, which will obviously vary by context and by groups. By calling this a description, it really was an invitation for our communities to be able to treat this description as a starting point for the local discussion and for community to adapt this description as they need for their particular context. So if their particular context calls for a definition, then it's fine, they can call it a definition, but that would be their decision for their particular circumstances. And we also wanted to make sure that this description was seen to be inclusive, that it was not an exhaustive list, and it would be adaptable to capture all the different experiences of the Palestinian communities across the globe. Another element that came up in the consultation and in their work is that too often anti-Palestinian racism is conflated under Islamophobia. And while anti-Palestinian racism does have connection to and overlaps with anti-Palestinian racism, Orientalism, and Islamophobia, it is very much a distinct form of racism that is experienced by those who are targeted by Israel's defenders when they publicly criticize Israel's treatment of Palestinians. And by failing to name this form of racism that we collectively experience, we are permitting the Palestinian exception to persist, and this further adds to the silencing of Palestinians and our allies. So again, another element of the feedback that we received from the consultation was a strong indication that anti-Palestinian racism could both target Palestinians and non-Palestinian allies. And what we heard quite consistently was that Palestinians said they still felt targeted and experienced harm when an ally was attacked for defending Palestinian rights. And we very much saw that reaction in the U of T scandal. We as Palestinians in Toronto really, collectively felt a response to the treatment of Dr. Azarova as a personal affront to ourselves. And further, many Palestinians themselves considered their allies as part of their community. And so when a non-Palestinian was attacked, that the resulting harm impacted the community itself. And ultimately, the silencing of non-Palestinians was, in essence, to protect the settler colonialism of Palestine. However, one thing that should be made clear was that the consequences or harms for Palestinians experiencing anti-Palestinian racism was usually greater. So we do not want to disconnect or discount the experiences of Palestinians. Another point that was raised in regards to this was that the expression of anti-Palestinian racism may be intersectional. So in other words, anti-Palestinian racism may be amplified for those who are members of historically marginalized groups. So for example, we've seen how our racialized allies are smeared and punished for speaking in support of Palestinian rights to discourage co-solidarities between movements. So for example, Angela Davis and Black Lives Matter, both have been targeted as anti-Semitic for their speaking out for Palestinian human rights. And that in silencing them, other forms of discrimination are leveraged to amplify the anti-Palestinian racism they experience. So at its core, anti-Palestinian racism aims to censor and erase Palestinians and their narratives from the public sphere, and by doing so to preserve unchallenged Israel's settler colonial practices against Palestinians. Now, this will vary by context and environment. However, anti-Palestinian racism may be experienced directly through punitive measures and causing harm to a person's reputation or denying them opportunities, or can happen indirectly by eliciting a broader fear of punitive measures to deter anyone in a particular community from sharing Palestinian narratives. And these tactics can take many forms, as many of us have experienced, and can include, but is not limited to, defaming a person's character or reputation, falsely accusing them of promoting hate, violence, or anti-Semitism, denying or threatening to deny a person opportunities or advancement, dehumanizing Palestinians and negating their experiences or blaming them for their oppression, or portraying Palestinians as inferior people or not supportive of democratic values. And the effect of this frequent and predictable backlash against those speaking on Palestinian human rights results in a chilling effect on the open discourse of Palestine, which is the ultimate objective. So many fear to participate in or support Palestinian initiatives, or even report their experiences of anti-Palestinian racism that they experience. And anti-Palestinian racism, or the fear of anti-Palestinian racism, then deters and shuts down engagement on Palestine, or will only allow or permit for a very narrow acceptable form of engagement. And this is where we see, for example, normalization tactics, or promoting the role of the good Arab or the good oppressed Arab woman. In those very narrow circumstances can we engage on Palestine. So in reflecting on our own experiences and those of our friends and colleagues, how many times have we heard that a particular position was anti-Semitic or sympathetic to violence, or that Palestinians have been described as homophobic or uncivilized or misogynistic, or told that Palestine was controversial or too political of a topic to engage in? And how many times have we felt that we had any recourse if we actually experienced anti-Palestinian racism, or felt that we always walked around in a paranoid state, or felt like we were being watched, or we questioned or second-guessed any of our activities or comments on Palestine, and constantly feared about a backlash? This is a collective experience that we wanted to tell and share in this report. And before we started using the terminology around anti-Palestinian racism, many of us had used international law to try to help us protect ourselves and shore up our positions. But international law isn't accessible for all of us, and all of us, being all community members, and it's not accepted in many venues, and it's in many cases readily dismissed by, when it is raised. So by naming anti-Palestinian racism, it gives us a new and direct and accessible way to talk about our experiences. Our initial writings on anti-Palestinian racism was for lawyers and judges in hopes that they would see us and understand our experiences, but they ignored it all. So instead, when we took on the writing of this report, it was written for our grassroots Palestinian community first, so we could address the racial trauma our community has experienced and that has gone acknowledged for far too long. We wanted to create a resource that allows, that lets Palestinians know that their experiences are seen and they are real, that this is not in their head. It is a collective and shared experience that we all experience, and that this experience has a name. And in doing so, we hope that Palestinians will derive some comfort and confidence, having their experiences validated, and will then feel empowered to speak on Palestine. And we wanted to give this report to the community as a resource and an advocacy tool that they can use in their local context to push back on the efforts to silence them. So just one last point I want to raise is that campuses to this day remain the hotspot for anti-Palestinian racism, partly because this is where the highest concentration of people willing to speak are located. Public schools are now becoming a new battleground, at least in Toronto and our surrounding areas. However, we are now seeing parents and educators using this report to mobilize against anti-Palestinian racism. And this includes one success story we recently had in Ontario, where these parents and educators managed to get a large school board to include anti-Palestinian racism in their newly released anti-racism policy. And it wasn't there in the first draft. So this was a very much a recent addition because of their mobilizing efforts. So we want community members to use this report in their advocacy work, to add it to their libraries, cite it in their papers, share it with their administrators and politicians, so anti-Palestinian racism is no longer treated as an acceptable form of racism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dania. Thank you. This was very insightful and very important to understand. I actually would like to remind everyone that at the end of these contributions, we will have 30 minutes for Q&A, for questions to address to our speakers. So everyone will have the opportunity to engage with the discussion and to contribute and ask questions to, as soon as we are done with contributions. The other thing I would like to actually say, I'm sorry I forgot to mention it, is that as I said, we have a translation available. So thank you all. Dania, thank you very much for taking it into consideration. I also would like to ask the others to exactly like speaking, considering that the translator is actually translating and needs some time to make sure that everything is translated correctly and properly. Also, I'm giving now the floor to our other speaker, Professor Abigail Bakan. So I would like to ask you all to keep in mind that contributions should stay around 10-12 minutes, even though it is a very important and very interesting and long topic to discuss, but exactly to make sure that we have time for Q&A, to just like keep this kind of time frame in mind. So Professor Abigail Bakan is a professor in the Department of Social Justice Education at OISE and a cross-appointment and Tanenbaum Center for Jewish Studies at University of Toronto. Her publications include Israel, Palestine, and the Politics of Race, which was co-authored with Yasmina Baban. Professor Bakan will get insight on the term of anti-Palestinian racism and building, continuing this discussion that Dania has just started with us, and on the way to deal with it, especially from the perspective of the book that she co-authored with Yasmina Baban. Professor Bakan, the floor is.
Thank you so much. I'm very pleased and honored to share this time with you. Thank you to Hassan Ben Imran and Ihsan Adel and Law for Palestine and ARDD for the invitation and for organizing this important panel. Thank you also to my fellow panelists, to our chair and our discussant. It is now common in Canada, I'm speaking to you from Toronto, to take a moment to acknowledge the land that we're on. So I just want to make a note of acknowledgement that I am speaking to you from a colonial territory of Canada or Turtle Island, and to acknowledge those who've come before and those who continue to resist as Indigenous peoples in the colonial territory in which I am privileged to be a guest. I also know that this is an event that is taking place in another colonial territory, and I'm sharing here with you a commitment to challenge the systems that generate dispossession and to make every effort to extend solidarity with all those who have suffered and continue to suffer from dispossession and colonization. So I feel very privileged to be able to share some thoughts about the concept of anti-Palestinian racism, and specifically the report titled Anti-Palestinian Racism, Naming, Framing, and Manifestations, and the work that was done by my colleague and co-panelist Dania, Majid, and the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association. It's really remarkable to see the international reach of this concept in this report, and to hope that it has some potential for empowering us. So I'd like to share some brief thoughts with you about the concept of anti-Palestinian racism, some of its manifestations, and also its relationship to other forms of racism, principally anti-Semitism. So the concept of anti-Palestinian racism is carefully named and framed. It offers us, as Dania mentioned, a language and therefore a way to open space to imagine Palestine solidarity, and relatedly, in the field that I work in the university sector, Palestine studies, as well as advocacy, with more confidence and breadth. It opens doors to the creative potential of the Palestinian experience in all its dimensions, historically and the present, and to the beauty and the strength and the power that is Palestine. Specifically, by naming anti-Palestinian racism as a very specific and real form of racism, the concept challenges a deep absence, and this is the absence that we now call the Palestine exception. The report states that erasure is a very important component of anti-Palestinian racism. Quote, erasing the human rights and equal dignity and worth of Palestinians, and also, again, quote, excluding or pressuring others to exclude the Palestinian perspective, Palestinians and their allies. This erasure and this exceptionalism has been common across political views and in multiple academic and scholarly disciplines. And this is where the second contribution of the report, not just naming it, but also looking at the manifestations of anti-Palestinian racism, is so important. In our educational systems, including the post-secondary sector, Palestine is not included in any standard curriculum, regardless of the area of study. In my own discipline of political science, a field dedicated to the study of states and power, Palestine is often absented, even though it clearly fits centrally into the remit of the discipline, which is about states and power. This is not just through a lack of knowledge. Palestinians have been rendered stateless by the Israeli state's settler colonial policies and refusals to institute international law and policy. And Israel, because it is seen as an exceptional state by being a quote unquote Jewish state, is treated as without any international comparators. So why is this case, and why is such a notable absence not only tolerated, but advocated and reproduced? Certainly anti-Palestinian racism is central to this. In my shared research with Yasmin Abulaban, who we're privileged to have as a discussant today, we draw on the work of the late Charles Mills to identify a painfully effective unwritten racial contract, what we have named the Israel-Palestine racial contract, that absents Palestinian lives, experience, history, rights, contributions, and realities from global politics and from related knowledge production. We know how racism works in colonial settler states, and naming anti-Palestinian racism at least gets our foot in the door to advance this conversation. But there's more. And this is where I want to turn to how all racisms in the current era are often coded And this coding takes various forms. One particular way that anti-Palestinian racism is coded is under false charges of anti-Semitism. I am Jewish, and I and my family are no strangers to anti-Semitism. I have no interest in minimizing or avoiding discussions of anti-Semitism. But I have a great interest in ensuring solidarity, and that means we need to be clear about what anti-Semitism is and also about what it is not. The word anti-Semitism is imperfect, like many terms that we inherit from various forms of politics and conversation. But in contemporary usage, I'll suggest three meanings. Anti-Semitism as anti-Judaism, which is a prejudice against the Jewish religion, and one in which you can convert in to Judaism or you can convert out. This is a very long-standing form of anti-Semitism, and it predates modernity. Anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism is a different form, and this, like other forms of racism, is grounded in ascribed phenotypes and stereotypes. It's associated with the concept of Jewish blood, quote unquote, into which one is born, and one cannot overcome by any actions, identifications, or beliefs. And this is the main way that we understand anti-Semitism in the context of anti-oppression politics as anti-Jewish racism. There's a third concept, sometimes referred to as the new anti-Semitism, which is a politically constructed claim that any criticism of the state of Israel is the same as anti-Semitism and must be silenced and opposed. This latter meaning is forwarded by powerful political forces associated closely with the interests of the state of Israel. And it is, in my view, a dangerous misuse of the term, but it's also widely adopted. So the notion of anti-Semitism figures into our understanding of anti-Palestinian racism in the latter two meanings. Anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism is, of course, very serious. It rises and falls over various historical periods. It is currently on the rise, painfully, in North America and Europe, particularly as a feature of white nationalist hate groups. I don't want to minimize this, but I also don't want to focus on it at this point. What I want to say is that we are misguided in challenging anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism by the misuse of the term, the new anti-Semitism, as if it applies to all forms of real anti-Semitism. Let's take an example. I, like many here, am a firm opponent of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance working definition of anti-Semitism. This definition and its examples is a wrong-headed use of the term anti-Semitism or the new anti-Semitism, which has led to pressure to narrowly define the term, and it is a form that is coded anti-Palestinian racism. The pressure for this definition is not coming from a place of anti-oppression politics, but with the view, indicated in many of the examples of the IRA working definition, to use the label of anti-Semitism in a way to suppress legitimate and necessary challenges to the Palestine exception that challenge the actions of the Israeli state. The IRA definition and its related examples has been used, as we know, as a way of silencing criticism of Israel's policies and actions towards Palestine and Palestinian rights. And it also blurs and makes difficult actual discussions of anti-Semitism as anti-Jewish racism. There is a cold, hard materiality of Israel's occupation of Palestinian indigenous land, of the violent and ongoing dispossession of Palestinians, and of the collaboration of major states like Canada and the United States with the suppression of Palestinian rights in the diaspora. This violent reality has been in part reproduced and covered up by racist stereotypes and coded charges against Palestinians that are dangerous and divisive. Many of us have refused this collapsing, and we have had some successes in pushing back the adoption of the IRA working definition on our campuses so far in Canada. And much of this is exhausting, painful work because we are up against forces with far greater resources than we have. But it has also showed some rewarding outcomes. We continue to make every effort to build new communities of resistance and inspiration, and it's immensely important that we have the language and the concept of anti-Palestinian racism as one form of racism in this context. We are stronger when we help each other and resist the divide and conquer tactics that are so finely tuned by the defenders of colonialism, neoliberalism, apartheid, and oppressive practices. Understanding the particularities and the details of anti-Palestinian racism, naming and framing it clearly and carefully has immense potential for liberation across communities, including the Palestinian and Jewish communities. The Arab Canadian Lawyers Association report and its methodology of consultation and review allows us to share a discussion about the context and offers lessons for those and for other examples so that we can build a community of greater solidarity in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Bakan, for your contribution for this very, very necessary insight and explanation of the controversial use of anti-Semitism when talking about Palestine and you know how it. I would like now to give the floor to our to our third Professor we talk about
sorry, Mjriam, we can't hear you.
As a Palestinian American journalist with Anti-Palestinian Racism, US Palestinian journalist, editor of Palestine books, and a contributor to many other books. His latest volume, co-edited with Impape, is Our Vision for Liberation. Engaged Palestinian leaders and intellectuals speak out. His books are translated to many languages, including French, Turkish, Arabic, Korean, Malayan, and many others. Professor Baroud, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Mjriam, and thank you to your other wonderful speakers and to the organizers of this very, very important discussion. My comments will be quite brief, and because really the contributions already made were quite clear and articulate. Just a few comments I would like to make here. To begin with, I think we need to understand the relationship between dehumanization and racism. I think this is very much applicable to the Palestinian context. I would say that any Palestinian history book written in Arabic about the history of the Zionist movement, about the Nakba, the catastrophic destruction of the Palestinian homeland, about Zionism in general is, always kind of dedicate a section to the kind of terminology used by early Zionists, and of course today's Zionists as well, in the type of dehumanization they have used against Palestinians, from Palestinians are cockroaches, Palestinians are beasts on legs, Palestinians, there was never such a thing as a Palestinian people, they never existed, all the way to Shakid's comments about, that Israel shouldn't just kill Palestinian children, but the mothers who have given birth to the little snakes, and I quote, of course, to Naftali Bennett's, for example, reference to how many Arabs he has killed in his life, and he has no problem with that. And the list goes on and on and on. And of course, these are not just random comments made by angry right-wing politicians. It's very much institutionalized in Israel, whether through the nation-state law of few years ago, throughout the history of the Zionist movement, and also through the behavior. The very idea, I don't know if many of us can remember in the Israeli war on Gaza 2008-9, so-called Operation Cast Lead, we all remember the scenes of thousands of Israeli tourists basically barbecuing at the border between Israel and Gaza and watching the white phosphorus coming down on Palestinians and all cheering in unison every time an Israeli strike takes down a Palestinian home. I mean, this is the kind of racism that defines Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. Now, how is that important and relevant to this discussion? Whether we like it or not, Western media, Western academia, Western intelligentsias, and so forth, in many ways are a reflection of that existing racist mentality that governs Israel's relationship with the Palestinians. I think this notion that the West exists in some sort of an independent space between Palestine and Israel, yes, they might be biased, misinformed. Yes, there could be all sorts of misinterpretation, misrepresentation, misconstrued discourses in Palestine, but ultimately it's a third entity. I think time and again is, it's proving to be wrong. The fact is Western ruling elites and in many ways mainstream media and academia really do see things eye to eye with Israel, and they do adopt and embrace at times fully the Israeli viewpoint in Palestine. And this latest war, the 3-day war, where 49 Palestinians were killed, including 17 children, was just another proof of that argument. If you follow Western mainstream coverage, it was disgraceful, but again, disgraceful, but typical in many ways. The references to Palestinian militants, Palestinian terrorists, civilians, even the fact that Israel admitted to its responsibility in killing the 5 boys in Jabalia, for example, including several brothers and cousins. Even the way it was portrayed by Western media as if they are trying to protect Israel from any backlash by explaining it was a mistake, the Israelis took responsibility, they apologized, and so forth and so on. And this is a story that we Palestinians have to deal with. I don't think that there is any room of separation between the Palestinian living in Palestine and Palestinian living outside of Palestine. We are all more or less having to confront the same type of experiences. In America, I am a victim of American racism that is part of an extension of the very Israeli racism that I would practice or I would deal with when I am back in Palestine. It really doesn't make much of a difference where am I in that kind of political geography. So I think dehumanization, Zionist dehumanization of Palestinians, and the way that American Western media and news adopted and embraced that dehumanization in terms of film, music, art of all sorts, media coverage, and so forth and so on. So that's one very important aspect. The other aspect, yes, of course, there is different elements to anti-Arab racism, anti-Muslim prejudices, versus what Palestinians, the unique experience that Palestinians have to deal with on a daily basis, and their supporters as well. And I'm referring here particularly to the so-called self-hating Jews and the, and the other so it depends if you are a Jew, you are a self-hating Jew. If you are a Palestinian, well, you don't really stand a chance. We are all stereotyped and portrayed to be terrorists or terrorist sympathizers. And of course, you are an outsider, then you are an automatic anti-Semitic. But the way that Israel has played this card, they played it so very well. We remember after the devastating attacks of September 11, how there was this kind of union between the Islamophobes, the neoconservatives, within American political establishment and society and media and academia and think tanks and so forth, and that of the Zionists in Israel, and how they kind of worked so very diligently to conflate between all issues in order for them to capitalize on their movement, the so-called war on terror and so forth and so on. So suddenly Hamas becomes Taliban, Taliban is Al-Qaeda, Shia are Sunnis, Sunnis are Shia, we are all the same, we all look the same, and we are all kind of more or less part of the same, terrorist infrastructure that the United States, along with Israel, are fighting against. So that's another element where I think racism against Palestinians, and I've experienced that myself. I mean, we were at the heart of the fight after 9/11. Many of us literally had to leave the country because we had no space to speak, to operate, to think, to work. Many of us lost our jobs, and many of us indeed have left the country because of how powerful that Israeli American military media machine managed to conflate between all the issues, and everybody became a suspect in that context. But ultimately, what we are dealing here with is the fact that many Western societies, and I'm not talking about ordinary individuals, although ordinary individuals find themselves kind of swept in the euphoria of racism and hatred and Islamophobia, but I am talking about governments and media, where there is the complete embrace of the Israeli position on many, many issues, and therefore we Palestinians do not find ourselves having to deal with a neutral environment in which we can present our point of view and defend it, and whether people agree or disagree with it, we can be part of that cultural dialogue, that intellectual debate. There is no intellectual debate to be had in the first place. You as a Palestinian intellectual, journalist, blogger, activist of any kind, you are not given the benefit of the doubt as an intellectual operating in society as such, but you find yourself under attack, accused, and marginalized in society. Recent polls coming out of Israel speak time and again of this incredibly racist mentality that many Israeli Jews have of the Palestinians, whether the Palestinians of Israel or the Palestinians in the occupied territories, or Palestinians and Arabs and Muslims everywhere else. And this is something that really kind of more or less fuels Israeli political thinking. Israeli elections are all kind of based on that foundation and that cornerstone of racism against Palestinians and the Palestinian threat and so forth and so on. And sadly, much of this, I wouldn't even say seep into Western societies. I think it's kind of taken at a wholesale value to become in many ways the perception that the West has of Palestinians. I am particularly pleased to hear, to learn about the new initiative, whether you want to call it definition or not, of the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association, and because it is about time for us to recounter, just move from the position of merely highlighting the kind of racism, the kind of prejudices, the kind of marginalization and dehumanization into a whole different sphere of we have our own definitions that are consistent with common sense, with international law, with the humanitarian law, with the civic laws of any given society, whether in Canada, in the US, or anywhere else. And we too are capable of holding those racists accountable. So I think it's a very, very important initiative. The question is, will it be enough, or could it in fact be a first step towards a collective movement in which we start holding the media accountable for every headline, for every word, for every sentence, for the language, for the discourse. And in order for us to finally be able to register not just our mere protest of this ongoing racism, but in fact, register that we are capable of holding individuals, entities, institutions, universities, and even governments accountable to this ongoing dehumanization and racism. I'm gonna stop here, and hopefully I did not exceed my time.
Sorry, yeah, can you hear me? Yeah, sorry. Thank you very much, Professor Baroud. This was, very, very fundamental point, highlighting the connection of anti-Palestinian racism with dehumanization. And we'll definitely have more time to discuss it during our session. I would like to give the floor to Hassan today, Professor Yasmin Abu-Laban. Professor Yasmin Abu-Laban is a political science professor at the University of Toronto. I'm sorry, I can't, and she has co-authored with Professor Bakan the book on anti-Palestinian racism. Professor Abu-Laban, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, thank you very much. Just a little correction. I'm actually at the University of Alberta, not the University of Toronto. And I am speaking to you, therefore, from Treaty 6 territory in what is colonially called Edmonton, Canada. So my thanks to the organizers of Law for Palestine for kindly inviting me to serve as a commentator on 3 very powerful presentations, which work to make the case for understanding anti-Palestinian racism. I only have a few minutes, so what I'm going to do in the time that I have is make a few observations and raise some questions for further discussion in this webinar. So let me start with some observations. So at one level, a concern with racism is not inherently new and has been voiced by Palestinian scholars and activists for decades. Arguably, you could even trace this back prior to the formation of the State of Israel. However, for a variety of reasons, including the murder of George Floyd by Minneapolis police, as well as the uneven and devastating impact of the COVID-19 pandemic, we are really living in a moment when there is increased political attention being paid to anti-racism by both governments and civil society groups across many states. And in thinking about combating racism, it is becoming ever more apparent that we also need to think about specific forms of racism. And so I find the report and framework provided by the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association and Dania to be timely, to be constructive, and also to be hugely contributory. And likewise, I found the entire discussion that we've just heard very pertinent to the contemporary moment. An additional point I'd make is that the framework of anti-Palestinian racism has elements which potentially bring together the experiences of Palestinians across geographic spaces of the Green Line, occupation, and diaspora. Now, Dania has acknowledged that the context of the specific report that the Arab Canadian Lawyers Association did really stems from from the Toronto, from Canada, from the diaspora. But there is also something potentially unifying in identifying anti-Palestinian racism, which is, I think, very much picked up by the comments that we just heard from Ramzy. And I think that this is really important because Something in the order of 3/4 of Palestinians cannot live or even visit what was their homeland, but also Palestinians are fragmented in Israel-Palestine. But I would say this fascinating discussion also raises some questions about how we understand combating anti-Palestinian racism. So let me turn to three that I have, and I hope either following my comments or in the course of discussion and other questions, we might hear from our panelists about some of these. Now, the first question I have concerns history. If we are to talk about anti-Palestinian racism and combat it, it seems useful to think about where it originates. And so one question I have for the panelists is where each would place the origins of anti-Palestinian racism. Is it in 1948 and the Nakba? Is it in the Balfour Declaration? Or does it come even before? Ramzy, for example, highlighted the sort of language used by early thinkers committed to political Zionism. Or alternatively, are we looking at something that is more recent and comes post-Nakba? A second question concerns how anti-Palestinian racism relates to other expressions of racism or discrimination that have been identified in scholarship or law through terms like Orientalism, anti-Arab racism, and Islamophobia. Islamophobia is also sometimes called anti-Muslim racism. So to be really clear, I think it's critically important and useful to identify the specificity of racism Palestinians experience. But can this form of racism be combated without simultaneously addressing other expressions of racism and discrimination like these, which is, again, something Ramzy highlighted in talking about the post-9/11 period, but also should we be thinking about still other forms of racism like anti-Black racism and specifically anti-Jewish racism as identified by Abby. And then a final question that I'd like to raise is how is anti-Palestinian racism best combated? Now, arguably today, we can see ways in which the racism and settler colonial violence directed at Palestinians by Israel is being challenged through, for example, the BDS movement and its calls, which focus on the right of return as stipulated in UN Resolution 194, ending occupation, and also the rights of Arab Palestinians in Israel. Arguably, the racialized violence directed at Palestinians is also being challenged through the growing number of reports in the UN and in human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, characterizing Israel as practicing apartheid. So does anti-Palestinian racism require its own specific form of mobilization to combat it? Or is it contained with these other movements and trends? If it needs something more specific, what does that ideally look like? So I want to thank all of the panelists. And at this point, I really look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Professor Abou-Laban. These are actually very, very thoughtful comments, and I look forward to discussing them and listening to the answers of our discussion today. Also, my apologies for getting the wrong university where you are teaching. Okay. So before giving the floor to our discussant to address the questions that Professor Abou-Laban has raised, I also would like to remind all the participants and here in this event, in this discussion, that we have found 20 or 30 minutes for question and answer. If you would like to either write your questions in the chat here on Zoom, we will collect the questions for our discussion and ask them to address them. Or if you would prefer to raise your hand, I will give you the floor and let address and raise your points with our discussion. We would prefer to collect 3 questions and then address them all together to facilitate also the discussion and have more time to address the different topics and the different issues that are raised in the here in our discussion. Okay, so what we have here is a very important framework for understanding and addressing anti-Palestinian racism. We had very important contributions that have basically outlined the current state of anti-Palestinian racism and how at different levels people are mobilizing to combat it, to understand to understand it and find ways to prevent it, and to make sure that Palestinians and all those human rights activists, lawyers, and people in solidarity with the Palestinian cause can actually face it and overcome it. We have started with the contribution of Dania Majid that has actually explained how they came up with the definition or actually description of anti-Palestinian racism and why it is important to name it and to have a framework that is able to address the specificity of this kind of anti-Palestinianness. The Canadian report that was released in April 2022 defines anti-Palestinian racism as a form of anti-Arab racism that silences, excludes, erases stereotypes, defames or dehumanizes Palestinians or their narratives. So this is very important. This is a very important definition that is highlighting how also Professor Bakan has further explained. Anti-Palestinian racism is strongly connected to 2 specific processes that are that of erasures of Palestinian history, of Palestinian presence, and that of exceptionalism when talking about Israel as a Jewish state and the Palestinian cause as an exceptional case that cannot be addressed, and that is based again on this kind of erasure. Professor Baroud has built on that and has also pointed out at how Palestinians are dehumanized and how this, this kind of process aims at, excluding Palestinians, or like the humanity and humanization of Palestinians from any discourse or for any kind of political approach to the Palestinian cause. What has been also highlighted through this contribution is the importance to also understand how anti-Palestinian racism is connected to other forms of racism that are emerging and that are being addressed at the grassroots level. How this, how the focus on other forms of racism is also allowing for better engagement that allows to educate anti-Palestinian racism. So starting with the question and the comments that Professor Abu Laban has shared with us, I would like to ask our discussant if they would like to answer the questions that Yasmin has shared. So where do you see anti-Palestinian racism originates? Is it something that is linked to the Nakba? Is it something that came post Nakba? How can we how can we trace the origins of anti-Palestinian racism? Again, how is anti-Palestinian racism as a specific form of racism related to other forms of discrimination and racism, such as anti-Islamophobia or Orientalism, or even other forms, that are not just related to the Arab region or, the Palestinian context, but, other forms of racism, such as anti-Black racism, or as Professor Bakan was saying, anti-Jewish racism. And finally, how is anti-Palestinian racism best combated? Should we look into specific forms of, and strategies to address this kind of racism, or and if we do need the specific strategies to address it, what are these strategies, and how can we all work to them? Whoever would like to start, Dania. Sorry.
I was just taking it's a lot. Okay, I'll try to keep it super brief. I mean, the history question is definitely an interesting one, and I did come across this question in doing the research, for the report. I mean, I guess my early instinct was, a lot of the anti-Palestinian racism is rooted in settler colonialism. So I would say it is tied to that, to that time frame where that happened. So that would be, 1948. There was a lot of stuff that happened before 1948. So, but the events and actions and the contributors that got us to 48 is where I would maybe put the APR timeline at, because in many what we're dealing with in modern time, at least, or in recent time, is the settler colonialism of Palestine and the silencing of us who dare to speak up against it. So this is at least my initial instincts. I haven't really done a big dig on that. I don't know, did you want me to do all three questions, or do you want to do one question at a time?
I think probably the whole three questions, so that then the other speaker can also address the three questions, if that's fine with you. If you prefer the other way around, that's also okay.
No, that's totally fine. In terms of APR being related to other forms of racism, I absolutely do think there is an intersectionality, and we've seen it play out. I was contacted recently by activists in the UK because they were dealing with a Muslim woman, racialized Muslim woman, who was elected part of her student council, and she's been attacked both for her position on Palestine, but those attacks come in the forms of a very Islamophobic tropes and attacks. So the two, they definitely do connect, and there is definitely overlap in how they manifest. I think in our report, what we heard, and why we really wanted to make a point about it being a unique form of racism, though, is what we heard from a lot of the people we spoke to, is that again, maybe at least in the Canadian context, was when anti-Palestinian racism was brought up to university equity officers or raised in the Toronto District School Board, the response those institutions gave them was, we are committed to fighting Islamophobia. So in response, and we saw this even in the Azarova case, and our complaints to the Canadian Judicial Council about the conduct of that judge, there was no acknowledgement by any institution that around like the experiences of anti-Palestinian racism. Instead, we are told, he doesn't have prejudices against Muslims, or that, when parents or educators or, raised anti-Palestinian racism, the response consistently has been, we are committed to fighting Islamophobia, and basically baiting and, trying to sweep anti-Palestinian racism by giving them anti-Islamophobia in response. So this is why, like, I do agree there's intersectionalities there. They are connected, but we also need to be very, consistent in talking about anti-Palestinian racism as a distinct form of racism. And then third, in terms of how best to combat it, I do think co-solidarities is important. And I do believe, again, at least in the Canadian or Western context, we have seen so much mobilization around settler colonialism for Indigenous communities in Canada. We have seen a lot of mobilization with Black Lives Matter and anti-Black racism in Canada, and also around homophobia. And Palestinian activists have been very active and involved in Canada and the US on these issues and participating in those issues as allies. And those communities have been very active and outspoken in supporting the Palestinian, the Palestinian cause. And from that, we have learned from one another and benefited from each other's successes. So I do think the groundswell of unprecedented support we saw in North America and possibly Europe around the attacks that happened May 2021, I had not seen a type of groundswell, response from people who were never engaged in Palestine, but to come out openly in support of Palestine. And I think that was because we had just gone through the George Floyd moment and learned those lessons, and those gains made by those, by our allies, opened the door for us as Palestinians to come in and talk about the racism we experience. And even though the people might not understand the history and the politics of Palestine, but they understood racism and were able to call it out and identify it without having, being versed in all things Palestine and having to become an expert first before they could speak to it. So our co-solidarities allow us to make gains and push the movement forward. But again, I do think there is work that needs to be done even within the Palestinian community, because I am still saddened that, in my years of, I was born into this activism, I inherited it from my parents, and I'm sad to still hear teenagers and 20-year-olds saying they're still afraid to speak openly about Palestine. We created the Toronto Palestine Film Festival 15 years ago to create that space so we can openly say Palestine and gather as Palestinians without that fear. So why does our young generation still have this fear? Why do even academics, even junior academics, or those of us like myself who's a lawyer in privileged positions, still have that fear? So I think there is work that needs to be done within our own community to have these conversations, to acknowledge the feelings, acknowledge the trauma, work through it, build those spaces so we can get the confidence to say Palestine in public and keep it forward. Because I think, if we can talk about it, then others will join us. But if we're afraid to talk about it, then how are we going to bring people to the movement? So those are my initial thoughts on these three questions. Thank you so much, Yasmin, for those.
Thank you, Dania, very much for your contribution. Also, I would like to I should remind everyone that we only have less than 10 minutes now until the end of our session here. So those of you who have things would like to share, please just do it.
Yes, Mjriam, sorry for interrupting. Just want to say if the speaker's time allow, then we may extend just for 10 minutes. So for the audience to ask and comment. Is it possible? Yasmin, Dania, Ramzy, Professor Baroud. Okay, good. Yes.
Okay, perfect. So I'm taking notes of the people who would like to speak after that. I don't know if Professor Bakan or Professor Baroud would like to add anything before we move to the Q&A session to address Professor Abu Laban's point so far. And just like taking in mind that we have 20 minutes. So yeah.
It's really interesting. There is a lot to be said, but I think to be fair to all participants and our listeners, it might be best to kind of move on to more questions.
Okay,
I'd be
that's
fine
perfect.
to. I'd be fine to hold comments until after we hear questions from the audience.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Mona Abu Amara. I don't know if yeah.
Thank you, Mjriam. Thank you all for an amazing presentations. And I just wanted to say a few words before asking my question. The importance that I feel, especially living in Canada, that the effects that Dania's work and the report that came out, more than ever, it's so important for people to feel that there is a support network, and that was missing. There's something to name their agony and anguish under, and to feel that they can just pick up this report and to have something, even if they don't have legal support or any form of ability to have someone stand for their thoughts or for what they believe in. They still have something that they can use to tell people this is real. And more so, it gives those who use the wrongful accusations of anti-Semitism less ability to play in that area, because you're closing it in and making people feel that there is something else going on, and not that it's one terminology against the other, so people start talking. And here the other important part, as Professor Bacon's sorry, I said your name, but Bakan expressed the deliberate blending between the two types of anti-Semitism that Professor Bakan just mentioned. That effect is the chilling effect. And for the Jewish community and for the Jewish intellectuals to be able to point that out makes all the difference, because it doesn't matter how much you speak about it, but those who are under the anti-Semitism fear and who have families who they care about, and they're not going to put themselves out there in harm's way if they didn't really believe that that is not the source of harm that's coming towards them, is so important. And we appreciate your voices on this, and we know how hard it is to stand, even especially sometimes as a Jewish person, and against these allegations and the weaponization of anti-Semitism, pretending that it is for the protection of the Jewish community, while it is actually to protect an entity and an apartheid structure and an settler occupation. So the use of that to silence the Palestinian advocacy jumped me to the point that Professor Baroud said about accountability. Why is it becoming so easy to take for granted whatever Israel says in a liberal democratic setting, and for people to be accused of being guilty until proven not? And even then, like if we come to say all the allegations about in regards to the 6 organizations that are facing closures today, we have a waiting list of countries that have been asking the Israeli government to provide just these claims, to provide some evidence, but instead they weren't able to do so. So they literally shut them down to just shut people's ability to expose the crimes that Israel is committing, while scaring everybody else in the world to think that they are dealing with terrorists. So that in itself is so disheartening, when you have to go through this with no proof, while you can shout all you can about proof of blood on the floors of Gaza and not get a response towards that, and be just accused of supporting terrorist parties after 15 years of blockade. So thank you all for saying those things. And I for me, my part, and I spoke to Dania about this, bringing the report to the global affairs, bringing it to the parliament, it's very important to speak to the officials, to push those things, the values, the principles, and all of that, to be able to use your work and leverage it more, and be able to provide you with a better platform to help those people who need the help. Only question I wanted to ask you, I wrote submitted an article about anti-Semitism and the not so typical wins for, let's say, Shahd and Mjriam's cases, that how easy it is to just accuse and then take back. But I had a hard time figuring out the difference between using anti-Palestinianism, because for me, it was the terminology I wanted to use about how Israel and its lobby use any action that they do against Palestinians, advocates, Palestine in general, even the last war on Gaza, as a pretext for the safety and security and well-being of the Jewish people. So I wasn't very sure. I used anti-Palestinianism, wasn't sure if I was supposed to use the other. So I would really love your input on that. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. Sorry, my video is off. Thank you, Mona. We also have a question that was sent by Maya. Speakers, I would like to read it to you all so that you can address it after we take also the third question that is coming from Riwa, who just raised their hand. So Maya is asking, Maya is writing, I'm Maya from the European Legal Support Center in Amsterdam. My question is, how do we determine discriminatory intent behind an act of anti-Palestinian racism? Are there any legal instruments to help us to do so? So this is your second question. And Riwa, if you would like to ask your question, please just be aware of our time limits so that we also have the chance to hear from our discussant and their answer.
Hi everyone. Hi everyone. Can you hear me? Hi everyone. Thank you so much for this event. I personally interested in this topic. I would like to comment about something that I personally experienced, especially in the latest aggression, 3-day aggressions in Gaza Strip. I believe that the image of the situation is delivered as a blurry image. What I mean by that I recently noticed there is another way of addressing the issue by the community. Like there is a soft language they use. They assume that it's two equal parts, like we as Palestinians and Israelis, and it's not like that. We are not. We don't accept to be addressed as two equal parts in this situation. They use this soft language as that it's our mission, both Israelis and Palestinians, to find a solution of what's going on, that we should find the solution. For example, if we want to stop the killing in two sides, killing of children and women, as they believe the two parts have innocent people. Like we should, in our part, we should stop defending, but they use another language to address this thing. So I believe they keep like I personally experienced this in a conversation with people via social media. They keep arguing about that. They keep arguing about that we should find the solution by ourselves, that as they assume two-state solution. And like it ended up saying that, sorry, it's time for me to sleep, so goodbye. And that's my comment, that it's really dangerous situation when it comes to use a soft language, word like coated with nice words, but they are addressing really dangerous terms. So thank you so much for addressing this term in this event today. Thank you. I have finished.
Sorry?
I was saying that I have finished, and I hope that my message and my comment is delivered for all of you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, I was just saying that if Professor Bakan or Professor Baroud would like to start addressing the points that have been raised by Mona and by Maya and by Riwa, so that we, yeah, who would like to start? Professor Bakan, or?
Sure. I'm aware that we have limited time, and I hope we can see this as just the beginning of other and many conversations, and provide the opportunities in the institutional forums that Zoom allows us to continue to build on this. I'm going to leave Maya's question about the legal response to our legal experts on the panel. The one thing that I will say about that is that if we start with the explanation of racism, in other areas of dealing with systemic racism, we don't always look for intent. We also know that racism can happen systemically because of systemic bias, and hopefully over time we can start to expand that in terms of how we understand anti-Palestinian racism. In terms of Riwa's comments, thank you so much for sharing that way in which, yes, sort of soft, informal, casual racism takes place and serves as a form of silencing. And the notion of two equal sides is another feature of this way that anti-Palestinian racism operates. We have this complexity because Israel established itself through the Zionist response to anti-Semitism in the West in a reactionary way. And so the language of Jewish rights has been militarized through the existence of the Israeli state. And for those who are progressive and of course, want to be on the side of justice, to be accused of anti-Semitism can be an incredibly painful argument and a painful charge. And so we have to get through this. We have to find our ways through it. And Mona, one of your suggestion, and thank you, I appreciate the comment about the importance of Jewish voices. And those of us in the Jewish community who are anti-Zionist and see ourselves on the side of Palestinian solidarity, we always go back and forth about, this isn't about us. Many of us are Ashkenazi and, we're white. Certainly the experience of anti-Semitism of our parents and our grandparents was much more intense than what we encounter now. And we don't want to draw attention to ourselves, but we have found ourselves actually being pressed by our Palestinian allies to say, you guys have to deal with the problems of, like we all have our own tribes, to deal with. And we have over the years found in organizations in Canada like Independent Jewish Voices and more recently the Jewish Faculty Network that we as allies and making it absolutely clear that this is in no way about not fighting anti-Semitism. We have to fight anti-Semitism more effectively, but we cannot use any suffering that has ever happened historically or in the present as an excuse to justify the oppression of another people. That is absolutely unacceptable, and it's ethically dangerous, but it is also we can't play into the divide and conquer strategies of colonialism and apartheid. We actually have to be on the right side of history, and we're stronger if we do that together. But having a historical and scholarly language makes a difference. And you know, Yasmin is my sister and my co-author, and always brilliant in ways that just saying exactly the right things. And of course, I don't have time to answer all these questions, but the issue of history is so essential in terms of understanding anti-Palestinian racism. We know it hasn't been invented recently, but unlike certain forms of racism, which have waned over time, anti-Palestinian racism has been intensifying over time. It's not following the pattern of sort of, you know, the age of apology and the end of apartheid. It is actually intensifying. And part of that intensification is because of the refusal to name it. And the challenge of naming it without also dealing with other forms of oppression. So I do think, you know, these new documents, recent documents, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, Al-Haq recently, and you know, the B'Tselem naming Israel as an apartheid state. And they sometimes do it in different ways, you know, where it starts and how it, but putting it under the label of apartheid, even though Israel does not claim that name, which is different than the apartheid regime of South Africa during the period of apartheid, is completely consistent with understanding anti-Palestinian racism. And that's really, really helpful. And it also allows for those of us who are Jewish Ashkenazi to understand the complexities of Jewish whiteness, which has also changed over time. In my own work, I call it, you know, we have been given a kind of whiteness by permission that, you know, which is consistent with supporting Israel and, you know, not rocking the boat too much. And then the minute that the Jewish community or anyone in the Jewish community stands up and says, no, I don't agree with this, your Jewishness is questioned. This becomes, you're a self-hating Jew. You're not, you know, you're not an authentic Jew. Well, no, I'm sorry. You know, there are many ways to have a Jewish voice, and there is a long tradition of Jewish solidarity and social justice that needs to be remembered and is part of the contemporary conversation. I'll leave it there.
Thank you very much, Professor Bakan. Professor Baroud, would you like to quickly address the question?
Absolutely. Yes, I will be very brief, and if you do allow me, I'm gonna try to lump few points together as opposed to address all the questions that have processed. Racism is not an outcome of a singular experience, collective experience in a specific time and space. Racism differs. Recently, I was in South America, and there I discovered that much of the racism, you know, against Palestinians in certain spaces there, although by no means does it compare to what's happening in the West, is related to the origins of Palestinians in South America and the idea that many of them came during the Ottoman Empire, which is really interesting because this was before Israel was established as a state or even as an idea. Yet here you have many Palestinians were referred to as the Turks, you know, but at the turn of the 20th century. And that kind of led to its own sort of socioeconomic and sociopolitical repercussions. This is different from, I'm talking to you from Italy right now, a country that once upon a time was one of the strongest supporters of Palestine within the Western political context. And yet it has shifted over the years to have such characters as as the leaders of the Liga party, for example, who are constantly communicating anti-Palestinian, pro-Israel rhetoric. So racism is not fixed. It's different from one collective experience to the other. It moves, it changes, but ultimately racism is a functional idea. It serves a purpose. It emphasizes superiority of one group and inferiority of others, and it constantly tries to undermine and marginalize and dehumanize and suppress those who are meant to be the victim of that racism. Now, I think the concept of anti-Palestinian racism, I think it's going to take a long time for it to really kind of be a fixed principle. And I think many Palestinian academics and activists in other spaces might find it problematic because it might not fit exactly their particular experience. And I do respect what the authors of the report said, that we try not to impose it as a definition per se, because it may apply differently to different communities. And that is absolutely correct. But then on the other hand, we do need such documents, we do need such definitions, if you will, because Palestine has been lumped into so many other contexts to the point that sometimes we fail to recognize the Palestinian experience as a unique in its nature, it's singular in its nature, and in the type of role that it has served throughout the years. I grew up reading the books of great people like Noam Chomsky, and I was always kind of surprised by the language always allocated to Palestine, of Palestine being part of, a victim of anti-colonial, Western colonialism, that includes Indochina and it includes South America and all of that. And at the end of the day, Palestine existed in leftist and liberal thought, even radical pro-Palestine thoughts, as part and parcel of a much larger platform. And as a result, Palestine quite often gets lost in this shuffle. And it's so very important that we say, no, the way that Israel, an apartheid colonial racist regime, is able to impose its centrality on the Western mind, why shouldn't Palestinians, the very victims of that Israeli apartheid and colonialism, why can't they create their own and impose their own centrality on the rest of the world as an issue that doesn't just exist whenever Israel decides to go to war, but exists independent from that and requires a just and fair resolution. Just one last thing I want to say before I forget, that as Palestinians, quite often we are kind of perceived to be kind of, as one of the speakers, I think, mentioned, innocent or guilty until proven innocent. It is us within the BDS movement, it is us within the anti-colonial, anti-apartheid and racist movement that is constantly being subjected to this habitual call to condemn anti-Semitism and to police our own movement and to find the racist amongst us, as if Israel has any moral upper hand on our movement. And we do play along because at times we are desperate, at times we are navigating and trying to operate within tiny little margins and spaces that is allowed for us. But if you notice, rarely do you see community, for example, condemning the anti-white racist amongst them. That is something that is so unique to our movement. And again, sadly, we end up playing along because we feel orphaned, we feel desperate, we feel alone, and we feel that if we don't check that box, we might not be allowed these little margins that are open to us within academia, within mainstream society. So this is why we really do need that definition. Call it anti-Palestinian racism, call it whatever you want to, but it's something that must emphasize and accentuate the centrality and singularity of the Palestinian experience within Western society.
Thank you very much, Professor Baroud. Thank you for addressing this point. Dania, do you have any remarks that you would like to share?
Sure, I'll just keep it very brief. And I do agree with Ramzy's, points. And, again, if people want to use this and feel like calling it a definition is what they need, and this is how they want to implement it, that is fine. As mentioned, like, we weren't coming out to impose something on a community, especially a global community that's so diverse. But if those communities themselves say this is the definition that applies to myself in my context and I need to use it, then absolutely, we're not there to, hinder or bar or, cause a barrier to the work that needs to be done. And that goes in terms as well with the terminology. We hear anti-Palestinian bias, anti-Palestinianists, Palestinianism, anti-Palestinian. I think these terms have been used interchangeably and are understood to mean relatively the same thing. So again, if in your particular context, bias is going to have more traction, or Palestinianism is going to have more traction, then again, you know who your audience is, and the situation you're dealing with. But I think at the end of the day, we are talking about the same thing, and that it is those unique experiences. And then lastly, on the question about discriminatory intent, again, when it comes to anti-racism discourse, it's usually the impact versus the intent that is the focus. So an act could be racist, even though it wasn't intended to be racist, if the impact was racist. But again, if you are in, a type of legal context, I would treat it like anything else. It is gathering the evidence that, I'm thinking in a human rights case, for instance, you're gathering the evidence, the narrative, the circumstances, and you're connecting the dots to show that this was intended, in the effect. But again, it's really what I see this term and, being used as it is a way to, it's an advocacy tool. It's a way to tell our narrative. So we shouldn't be so hindered by the legal context, because we've used anti-Palestinian racism in the legal context, and the courts just ignored it. All the judges in the Azarova case ignored it. We will keep pushing, and we absolutely need to keep pushing them and the politicians to get it understood. But they are not the only line of the line of defense or target for this definition. It is also for us to use in telling our stories and pushing our advocacy forward. So I wouldn't get too caught up on the legalities of things. Just tell your story and frame it as such, and explain it in your work why you believe it is anti-Palestinian racism, and don't necessarily get too hung up on legal instruments and case law and all those other things.
Thank you very much, Dania. I would finally ask Professor Abu Laban if she has any remarks. Yasmin, do you have anything you would like to add before we end this session?
No, I just want to say this has been a fabulous discussion, and thank everybody for their input.
Thank you very much. Of course, first of all, thank you to our discussant, to Dania, Majid, to Professor Bakan, Professor Baroud, and Professor Abu Laban for starting this very important discussion on anti-Palestinian racism. And of course, thank you to Law for Palestine and ARDD for arranging this, organizing this event, which was very, very important. Thank you to Jurists for Palestine Forum for joining us today. What I would like, to say to close this session is that this conversation
is very timely, and it is fundamental at this point in our history. What I really think it's important that, you know, that was discussed today and that was highlighted today is that anti-Palestinian racism and the kind of discrimination the Palestinians and all those in solidarity with Palestine have to face every time that they try to advocate for Palestinian rights is the outcome, is the result of a traumatic collective trauma, a collective trauma of attempted ongoing erasure of Palestinian history and Palestinians in general in this project of settler colonialism that is still ongoing. So the answer, should be a collective one. So this was the first step, a very important step in this sense in addressing this issue. So we hope that this is, that we are going to have other opportunities to continue this important conversation. So thank you everyone for joining us and for giving us the chance to actually talk all together and discuss it all together. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Thank you,
Thank you,
Mjriam.
everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Yasmin, Dania, Ramzy.
Thank you.
Bakan, Noor, and Malik. Thank you. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.